Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
Forgot board
I got board
game.
game. I am Ben,
I'm John.
and today this is actually going to be an IGBG Explains. So we are here to explain something to you.
Yep. And we're going to be
And
explaining
we will be.
how to take turn.
Oh, I thought it was like disgruntled children.
That works too. We can do that.
Yes, today we will be talking about taking turns, or specifically the topic, the term of turn order,
Yes.
which is something you will hear obviously a lot if you play board games.
She doesn't think it's your turn.
Yeah, she clearly doesn't. She's fighting for it. And specifically with turn order, in kind of planning this out, we decided to actually split it into two videos, so it's not super long. It's gonna hopefully be two videos. This first part, we're gonna talk about the main terms that are used related to turns and time in playing board games. And so that would be basically the words like turn versus round versus phase versus scenario, like a scenario, and versus game. So kind of going in that order, we'll talk about those basically from what we believe is the smallest to the largest kind of measurement of time in a game. And we'll also mention at the end the idea of simultaneous and real-time games, which are a different genre of games, but it relates because it has to do with the pacing and the timing of a game.
Mhm.
So we'll also touch upon that. And then the second part of this topic that we'll hopefully do not too long from now, we will talk about the traditional idea of set turn order. So games and how they can just kind of keep a consistent way of doing turn orders.
Mhm.
And we'll compare that to newer, more modern ideas in games of how turn order can change and how that affects the gameplay and how it feels. And
Mhm.
so, getting into today's topic,
Yep.
comparing all these terms. So, actually, in comparing all these terms, we do want to point out and clarify why we're talking about these terms and basically defining them in what we have kind of experienced and come to think is what makes most sense for these terms and how they're used and what they mean. We are not recording this to be anal.
Yes, we are.
That's what you came to learn to do. No, at least I know I can say for myself, like I'm very particular about my words and word choice. And, I want my words to mean what they mean, to convey what I want them to convey. And so, I don't want to just kind of use a lot of my words loosely and hope you get what I mean. I want to.
Stupefenders.
What?
Stupefenders.
Is that what that means?
That's just a made up word. So
John's words do not mean what they mean.
exactly.
And that causes problems, as you can see. So I think with that in mind, that kind of way of thinking, like that's why we find it important to use words in a specific way so that they mean something, convey the right idea. And especially when it comes to playing games, the whole idea of, say, going through rules and learning a game and reading all that language is so you can enjoy the game. And if the rules aren't written clearly, aren't using consistent language, consistent meanings with words, then that can cause problems and make a game not enjoyable.
Yep.
Right. And so that's why we want to kind of present these definitions that we think make most sense, are most intuitive, and most commonly seen in games to help you kind of hopefully understand and learn games more easily.
That's right.
And so going into this comparison, first we have the smallest measurement, which would be the term turn. And yeah, you guys have probably all heard this before. It's not any novel word, but it is kind of the smallest measurement because a turn is essentially one player or one turn's chance to take action, right? And so that's just the simple way of understanding it, right? When it's someone's turn, that's their time to make a decision, do whatever action in the game.
Mhm.
And so
And
that is
a-
turn.
and even in that way, like it doesn't necessarily have to be an individual person's turn. It could be a collective group. So like
Mhm,
maybe it's a game with teams, right?
mhm,
So you think of a game like Codenames. You take turns in, you having your person who gives a clue, and then your team, together has to make a decision about what they're going to do, and that's part of the turn, right? So just giving as an example, right? It
mhm,
doesn't have to be only one. It could be a number of people, but there is a order in that way.
mhm. And so then after that, kind of next step up, a really common term is.
Is around. So I think also somewhat self-explanatory, but I think it is something we like to call out, and we specifically wanted to call out here too, is around is usually a series of turns that occur. And at the end of this series of turns, usually allowing at least one turn for each player or each person in the game, then that would be the unit of the round, right? Um, there are some games where you can cheat or you can do things that allow you to have multiple turns within a round, which would be a thing. But then at the conclusion of the round, it ends at that point, and then there's in a sense a reset of turns the following round if there's another round that comes after. So basically the unit of measurement for rounds is the sum or the culmination of turns within a round, again usually with an equal number of turns for players.
And John mentioned us wanting to call these out, these two probably like most common terms that you'll hear in a game, is because as intuitive as those definitions might sound, you might be like, why did we talk about those? There have been games that we've come across over the years where the rules don't use those very clearly or distinctly from each other, and that's very annoying. Basically, cases where a game in the rules are saying use the word turn to refer to everyone getting a turn,
Yeah.
and it's like, so you mean a round? It's like, why do you call it this way and set yourself up to confuse us?
Mhm. Yeah, or they'll mention rounds in a game, but they never specify what are the activities a person has in a turn, right? They might explain what a player can do, but there has been some rules where it's not so clear about what really constitutes the end of a person's turn, except for if they
Mm.
run out of actions or something. But then it's not clear, like, so then is my turn over if I have 0 action points, or can I technically still do things even though I have 0 action points? So does that mean the round is over, or is my turn over? Right? It when you're not clear about some of those rules, it like especially in some of these games where they're printing and you're supposed to be chaining actions together, it can cause some confusion or a lot of like rules clarification that's asked, because there it's like, well, if I interpret it this way because it's not clear, that means my turn is infinite and you never get a turn. And then you could be that little girl crying about her shovel being taken from her.
So yeah, so at least starting with these two, that's why we wanted to call those out, make those very clear. So designers, please use them correctly and consistently in your rules.
But
And so
sponsor us, please, too.
and so then after that, kind of what we would generally say, more often say, is the next bigger unit up is the term phase. Because usually when you're playing a game that uses a term phase, that is one that is used quite often, at least when people explain things casually, is like, a game could be divided into 2 phases. And so the first phase has maybe this number of rounds or players taking this many turns. And then the feel of the game, or, each player's goal, what they're striving towards and playing towards, changes when the game maybe resets in a way, moves on to a second phase.
Mm.
And so that's why it's kind of bigger, right? Because a phase, usually we would see a game with maybe 2 phases. I think I mean I believe there could be games with more phases, but then in this way, a phase consists of rounds and turns, and after those have finished, then more characteristically, the feeling of the game changes as it moves into the second phase. But then it's also important to mention with phase, because what I was saying is we generally think it's the bigger unit, but there are cases, which also are quite common, that the term phase is used in a very small way, where it's a more kind of like a descriptive word to describe the kinds of actions that a player has to go through on their turn. So making phase in that case smaller than a turn, because it's basically, during one person's time to take action, they have to draw a card, they have to play a card, they have to clean up their cards or stuff that they played, and then that finishes their turn after going through those, for example, 3 phases. So that is kind of the way that phase could be smaller, but I think it usually hasn't been an issue, I would say, when it's used in either of these ways, the really small way or this much bigger way of splitting a game in half.
Yeah, I would usually say it does become iffy language when a game has both 2 phases, right? Like the way that we're defining it, right, as the larger one. But in addition, it also has separations within the round, within the turn of a player that also is, could be determined and could be segmented out in these different ways. So that's why we wanted to call out phase in particular, because that like the term phase can be used in 2 different contexts potentially within the same game. So that's why this is the one with a little call out.
Yeah, we in our notes we put an asterisk, so we made sure to point out how it can be used in these 2 different ways. But then also, along with these definitions, we have set aside some games I just kind of want to mention now to show and briefly explain as examples of what we're describing. So clearly, like with turn and order, that's almost in all games, so we didn't think that was necessarily that important to show any random game for those. But then once we get to phase now, right, where it could be used in these different ways, we have some examples of games where it could have 2 different phases. For example, let me get these.
Big stack.
Ugh. So for example, Brass Birmingham. Oh, love this game. And hopefully John will actually get to play it someday.
Never offered. Like a root. Never offered. Never offered.
So in Brass, it's kind of like this industrialization setting. And so the game clearly has 2 phases where you're initially using all your resources to build up, I believe it's train routes when they were still using coal. But then eventually everything resets, like you clear off your routes and then start needing to build shipping routes after things have technology has advanced, basically. And so both phases are very distinct because you're not only because of the reset, but because you actually play that whole game with building rails and then building up your buildings and manufacturing and such. But then you score for everything that way first. And then all those routes get cleared and you start over and then score the new routes and buildings at the end. So it does build on itself, but there is that very clear reset in the middle. What was another one that had phase?
Magic.
Huh?
Magic phase.
That's right. You love it, Magic Maze, which we have reviewed on this channel if you're curious. And this is one that we'll actually refer to again a little later when we get to the real-time part of this episode of IGBG Explains, because it also fits that. But for this purpose and talking about phases, this game still has 2 phases also, even though it's not as clear as everything resetting. But it is the whole idea that the first phase, everyone's working together to get all these characters to their own shops to basically steal the items they need. And then once everyone is in the right spot and they decide to steal, then you basically flip your goal to trying to get out of this mall and get everyone to their own exits. So Magic Maze is another one where there are 2 phases in a slightly more subtle way. And then even more subtle is Clank, which
Clank.
we have also reviewed on this channel, and Clank in Space, where in both of these, they are deck building, dungeon diving games where you're trying to also get in and get out, similar to Magic Maze, but a little more subtle because it's competitive. And so you aren't all working together at the same pace of getting everyone to the same place, steal, and then everyone get out. Since it's competitive, you're doing it at your own pace. But there is still that split of once you are getting in and getting the artifact that you want to take for points, then you need to get out, right?
Yeah.
Your objective changes at that point. You're not going to keep going for artifacts. You're actually not allowed to generally. So then you just got to get out. So even more subtle way of doing the two-phase idea in a game.
And then one other I'm going to also mention for the phase, although neither of us have it on hand or in person, is a game called Betrayal at House on the Hill, I believe, where basically that is a game that actually has very distinct phases in the game, where basically you start the game cooperatively, completely cooperatively. Everyone's just exploring this house, and then what happens is an omen will set off the haunt, I believe is what it's called. And then at that point, there's actually two different, like there's a scenario booklet, and then there's like the scenario booklet for the survivors, and then there's a trader's handbook typically. So then what will happen at that point is based on, a number of rules. The game completely changes at that point, where there are some very few circumstances where all the players work together. Typically what happens is it's usually one player versus all the rest of the players with their own conditions, their own rules about what they're supposed to do. And it marks a very different way of playing the game from that point on. So that is another very explicit example of two different phases of a game.
And so then just right now that a couple of examples I have on hand of phase being used in the other way, which is also pretty common, like we mentioned, right? Of describing the actions that make up a player's turn or that make up a round. We have Bargain Quest, which we have also reviewed on the channel, so you can check it out. But in Bargain Quest, like the rules are written out in a way so that there are all these phases to one whole round of the game, where you're basically choosing the card for your display and then going through attracting the heroes to your store, then selling to them, then sending them out, then having them draw random blessings or curses or, the status cards, and then fighting. And then you can spend your money to buy and upgrade your store. So those are actually laid out as phases, and games that use phase in that way also make it really helpful for players when they include it in their player aid, which I know Bargain Quest does. Basically on the side of your store board, it's has all these phases listed. I think it's like around 7 phases, but in listing it out, it makes it clear what everyone is going through step by step in that round. And then the second example is Mountains of Madness. Co-op, super silly, real-time game. But in this one, you also have essentially 2 phases, but not to the whole game, but to a round, where the first half of a round is basically the real-time part where you're trying to match symbols in real time and deal with whatever madness is you're inflicted with that makes you annoying to communicate with. And after that, it moves on to the phase of like resolving and planning for the next round. And so there is still kind of that idea of these different phases that you go through, and those being the 2 main ones, but there are these number of phases that you go through in the round. So that is how to understand the term phases. And then going on bigger than that, we have the term scenario, which John will share about.
So in this case, we're moving kind of beyond phases at this point. So, right, we had turns, which is player, individual players or, collective players, their ability to take actions. We have a round, which contains, all of the steps in which players are taking actions. Then we have the phase, which is usually kind of how rounds play out, throughout the game. So, how the turns and how the rounds will play. So then in this case, now we have the scenario. So scenario is a much bigger term. So basically a scenario is effectively best described as what are the objectives of the particular, of the game that you're playing at that time, right? So it's kind of usually set up. A lot of times people think of campaigns as a situation, or when there's a particular setup to a game where you have a very, particular way of how you're supposed to play, or maybe a specific kind of objective that you need to reach and achieve within that game play of that time. And then, the way you can kind of distinguish it is in all of those scenarios, typically the rounds, the turns, the phases, the rounds, and the turns will remain the same if you played the scenario. But depending on the scenario that you play, your objective might be different for the end of each of those scenarios. So that's kind of the best way to think about it. So to help understand that, we'll use some examples of the games. So the first one we'll show is Time Stories, which we have reviewed as well. Non-spoiler and spoiler versions of this game. But in effect, Time Stories, every expansion, every game, like the base game and every expansion is a scenario in and of itself, right? So in Time Stories, you have a particular scenario that has, usually it's a mystery, right? You're trying to solve something or try to figure something out. When you play Time Stories, it typically the turns, the rounds, the phases that happen in the game are always the same, right? Like the basic skeleton, right? Like every time you buy a Time Stories, the white box, the expansions, you're not going to have to relearn the rules, right? Like you're not going to relearn or figure out a new way of playing the game. It'll tweak pieces of things of how they interact with each other, but the turns are still played the same way. The rounds still interact the same way. The phases still occur the same way in the game. So that's one, example of, scenarios. Other ones we have, did you pull any legacy games on you?
I did not, but legacy games.
Legacy games.
And so, which we probably mentioned before, like when we talked about Pandemic in one of our much earlier videos. Yeah, legacy games are ones where you are playing through a campaign, as John mentioned, like a whole storyline consisting of multiple different sessions you're playing. But then while you're playing it, each session is considered a scenario, right? It's set up a certain way. You have a certain goal. Some story point is happening in that specific scenario. And so legacy games such as Pandemic, Legacy Season 1, 2, and 0, the most recent one. But also other legacy games such as Clank Legacy and Charterstone, and even ones like Werewolf Legacy and Betrayal Legacy.
That's one.
Those exist. So, and Risk Legacy, the original Legacy game. They all, are made up of these scenarios that you set up and play for a certain goal.
Yep. So that's another version of scenarios, and then maybe some lighter versions. So I think the two that we kind of mention are pretty campaign heavy, or kind of like very like what you do in like throughout that scenario will affect other, as you're continuing to play through the game, will affect the, the next playthroughs within that scenario or within that campaign. Games that are a little bit more scenario specific, right, and won't affect others is games like Robinson Crusoe. Yeah. Making Ben lift all the games. So Robinson Crusoe, basically you play as like think Gilligan's Island or Robinson Crusoe, the story, right? Basically you're shipwrecked, stranded on an island for some reason, typically, right, in the scenarios. And in Robinson Crusoe, I think there's like 5 or 6 different scenarios based within the game, if I remember correctly. And it basically lays out an objective and how to set up your game. But once you set up the game, then you play through it, right? And then usually you'll be able to choose new characters or different characters to play through throughout the game. and kind of try to figure out how to survive or how to figure out, whatever thing you need to do on the island. So that's an example of that. So an example of a scenario-based game that I have. So not Ben only showing board games, but I have board games too. Is
You got board game?
I got board games. Is Spirit Island. So if you watched our top 10 games played of 2020, this was on my list. Was this number one? I think this was number
No, not number one.
Wasn't it number one?
Was it?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Keep going. I'll look.
I'm like 99% sure it's my number one. But Spirit Island. Basically, this is a cooperative game where you play as a spirit of an island, and you are basically trying to kick out those pesky European explorers. So this is very much an anti-colonialization game. So if you've ever played Settlers of Catan, this is the opposite of Settlers of Catan. This is the drive them out of Catan board game. Really fun. But why I mentioned this one is this is also kind of a light version of the scenarios, as we mentioned, is that every time you play this game, you can set it up in a different way, where there is, I believe, the base game has 4 different European exploration countries that each have their own unique, strengths and weaknesses as a colonial race. And then every time you play the game, you can set the level of difficulty for the scenario that you're playing, right? So you can set it up where there's certain conditions that are affecting the island, usually to the benefit of the explorers. So it actually is to your detriment. So it makes the game harder and harder to play, but you're setting up these various scenarios for how you're going to drive out the explorers from your island.
And yeah, it was your number one on the list. Wow. Yeah. So I guess it must be okay.
That's right. Go get it. It's great. Or ask me. I'll play.
And actually, and similar to this kind of way that John's talking about scenario, I do have an example too of 5-minute mystery, which I think unboxed on the channel, and then we also reviewed 5-minute dungeon, where these also, even though they're real time, they, for 5-minute dungeon, you're choosing a boss to fight. And so that's kind of setting up that one scenario you're playing through. Gameplay is the same, but the difficulty can change, right? So that's a really small way of how you could describe it as that kind of scenario you're playing through. And same thing in 5-minute mystery, you're choosing what mystery you're trying to solve. So it actually changes the amount of time you have, not always 5 minutes, but then also like who you're trying to catch, how many people you're trying to catch, and different limitations on that. So those are also ways that in a very simple way have a scenario kind of set up.
Yep.
And so then moving on to the last term we have in this kind of unit of time measurement is game, right? The most generic term, which we've probably used a number of times when we've been talking already in these other definitions. But obviously game refers to the game itself, right? That you're choosing to play. But when it comes to a unit of measurement of time, and when players use that term, it's referring to essentially the whole session that you're playing that specific game, right? And so it basically, when you play a game of something, it consists of all the scenarios you're choosing to play that night. So the way we just talked about scenario, right? Like in Time Stories, you can pop open one expansion, set up, play number of runs, right? Each one of those being in the same scenario, but then you would maybe count that whole time that you played as a game, right? We played a game of Time Stories and it took this many runs, and we even played multiple scenarios. But that was our game night, if you will, right? Playing through that game in all these ways. And so that's kind of a way that's used in the biggest way.
Yeah, you could break down game to slightly smaller, to like multiple games within that game session, right? Like you could do, as you were saying, multiple runs, so that's multiple games of that, of that scenario, but it's still contained within the unit of the game, right? You wouldn't be playing those scenarios without that game as the game, kind of thing, right? Because the game is a bigger thing.
Yeah, I mean, pointing out what you just said is really important too, because that is the casual way of also talking about it, right?
Yeah.
Playing through a scenario one time, maybe we failed, that could be also considered a game, a
Mhm.
gameplay session of it.
Yeah.
And then we reset, set up the scenario again and try to win it again. That's another gameplay of it.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that is another way that people use the term game.
Yeah.
So it could be, but it is on the bigger side, basically,
Yes,
right? It could
exactly.
mean each time you're trying it, or to the whole, all the times you're
Play.
trying it,
Exactly.
however you're talking about it. And so, in mentioning these units of measurement and these terms, and hopefully providing some clarification on it, we do kind of want to mention now toward the end of this video those other genres of games that I mentioned at the beginning, that is simultaneous play games and real-time games. They're
Mhm.
generally described as mechanics in a game, right? Like the game has like this simultaneous play section, or this
It's
simultaneous
real
play
time.
phase, or it has the real-time mechanic where everyone's playing at the same time.
Mhm.
And why we want to mention that is because it has to do with measurement of time, right? Like how people, when playing a game, experience the pacing of a game,
Yeah.
the flow of time during the game, where then all the terms we used were really concrete, right? Of, on players have their turn where they take these actions, and then after everyone takes their turns, that's a round. This many rounds makes up this phase. Move on to the second phase. That's when you maybe finish through what consists of the scenario, and you've done that several times, so you've played the game.
Mhm.
But then when we bring up stuff such as simultaneous play and real time, those are cases where those terms might not actually even matter, right?
Mhm.
When you talk about simultaneous play, you're not going to be referring to phases, but more so maybe just constricted to rounds or turns, right? Where
Mhm.
everyone's turn is at the same time.
Yeah.
So not even a sequential order of turns making up a round the way we described, but simply we just take turns at the same time. And
Yeah.
this many turns makes up the whole game.
Mhm.
And so an example of that would be
You go first.
Avenue, which we have reviewed, which is a roll and write. And so actually a lot of roll and writes, or this is technically a flip and write. And same with Welcome to another
Mhm.
flip and write.
Yeah.
But games in that genre really lend itself to being simultaneous play,
Mhm.
because you're essentially revealing a card or rolling a die, and whatever comes up, everyone gets to use it, and they get to mark it on their own sheet, player sheet or player board. And so they're not, doing it on a shared board. So it doesn't really matter what order you do it in, right? Which player goes first. You're just playing it on your own sheet. So you can just do it all at the same time. And so, yeah, roll and writes, flip and writes lend itself to being simultaneous play.
And another type of simultaneous gameplay game is Sushi Go and Sushi Go Party. Woo, woo, woo. Sushi Go, if you're not familiar with Sushi Go or Sushi Go Party, is a drafting game. Basically, you are, which I actually never realized this, but someone mentioned it. I think my brother mentioned to me. It's like you're at a sushi restaurant at a conveyor belt, and that's
Mm.
basically how you play the game. And that's what the concept of what you do. Basically, it's a drafting game. And we haven't done a BGB on or IGBG Explains yet on drafting, but maybe we will soon. But basically, all of the players will be selecting a card from a set of cards in their hand, and you all put it face down in front of you. And then once everyone has prepared their card, everyone flips it over at the same time. And then there are some occasions of like certain powers that need to be done in a certain order, but basically you don't get to see it, right? And there are certain cards that actually get affected by if you play the same card as somebody else, that you actually lose out or something happens. So that is a thing. But that's the idea behind kind of simultaneous play that still has a sense of turns, in the sense of like everyone has to do something before you move on to the next action sequence. But you wouldn't really call it turns, right? Like nobody has an individual turn, right? Everyone's doing it at the same time, which is kind of the distinguisher usually with simultaneous play is, I would usually say most of the time it's turns that kind of gets brought together. And it's
Mm-hmm.
usually associated as rounds to a game,
Mm-hmm.
but not always the case.
Mm-hmm.
Not always the case.
And then even sometimes that's when the term phase could also be used in a small way if the drafting is just a single part or single mechanism that's part of the game, right? People would say there's the drafting phase of the game, and then you go on to the other phases or other kinds of actions. Where then Sushi Go is almost all drafting, so it is
Pretty much the entire game is drafting.
yeah,
There
yeah,
is like the scoring at the end, but like you're not like that's not playing, right? Your
yeah,
players
yeah.
aren't taking actions during that point in time.
Yeah, so then that's why it would just be referred to as rounds in that case. No need to distinguish it with other phases since the game doesn't really have other phases. And so then similar to how simultaneous play then kind of, bypasses the use of these terms we've been talking about, the category of game that does it even more is real-time games, which are games where you're all playing, just doing all your actions at the same time.
Play the game.
So there's no turns similar to simultaneous play, but then sometimes not even rounds. The whole game is just happening all at once, and you go until either time runs out or you fail, right? But it's not like in games that are pure real time. Yeah, there's no rounds of like, okay, let's play real time now, do something else, and that's the round, and then we come back to play real time. It's literally just start the game and go until it ends. And so more pure real-time games are like what we mentioned, Magic Maze, right? Where there is a timer to the game basically. So you just start and keep going and then hopefully get more time when you need more time. But if it runs out, you lost. Or if you get out correctly, you win. So that is kind of a pure real time. And similar to what I mentioned before, 5-minute mystery, co-op real time, where the scenario you choose will determine how much time you get. And then you just play through during that timer and see if you can beat it within that time.
Usually 5 minutes, given that it's called 5-minute mystery.
Usually, not always.
Not always, but usually.
And then similarly, another game we've reviewed on the channel, Escape. Is quite a pure real-time game also. It's about rolling dice in real time. So, there's no taking turns of when you can roll your dice. You can just keep rolling them when you have them available.
The faster you roll, the better. That's
Yeah.
what I always say.
and then there's a timer to the game. So you're just gonna keep going and hopefully try to escape before the timer runs out. And then this one, since it is kind of a bigger game and how it has that adventure feel to it, there are somewhat phases to it that the game divides into, where it's, the first phase is a certain amount of time on the timer, where then there's kind of a possibility of getting inflicted with some kind of bad case. Well, basically you could lose like one of your dice permanently, and then you continue with the timer until
I totally forgot about that part. That's right, you're supposed to get in the middle. Totally forgot about that.
Yeah. So it is kind of segmented, but in that case it's using the term phases, right? But then also all the phases are the same essentially. It just has those little breaks in between the whole game, the whole timer. And then we also have another real-time Captain Sonar, or what you might find in Target nowadays, I think just Sonar. It could be the same game, or there's actually a version that's for fewer players, like 2 to 4 players, where the original Captain Sonar is for 4 to 8 players. Or I guess it says 2 to 8, but...
eight as in 4 on each team. At first I was like, what?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, this is a team versus team real-time game, which then also doesn't actually have phases. It is quite a pure real-time game, where once the timer starts, you're all doing your own actions as different crew members, and so they all have different actions on one team. but they're all trying to communicate in a way so that the captain can decide where to move your ship or when to try to fire at the opponent, where then other members are trying to detect where the opponent's ship is, and
Listening
another
to the
member of your
conversation.
crew is trying to construct the items you need to use, the different weapons or tools to help you. And so it's a team versus team real time. And so there isn't a timer to it, but the timer is basically when one team defeats the other team.
Shoot them torpedoes.
And so then, in this one, you actually, need to be fast in your thinking and your action on your own player board.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the last example I have is one I did mention before, Mountains of Madness, which is a co-op real-time game, which then also, like I mentioned before, has phases to a round, right? You have multiple phases to kind of setting up and different, actions you can do to plan for what's going to happen. But then the primary phases are the real-time action part and then resolving it. And so then during that phase, everything is happening within a certain time limit, very brief time limit, like a minute and a half or something like that, maybe just a minute. And so, so then this is another game that has real time, but then also does incorporate the idea of rounds, because the leader does rotate at the end of each round. So the person who can make decisions for the team as they're going. But then aside from that, there's still no turns, because everyone's just going at the same time during the timer. And then you just finish that round past the leader and keep going.
And one thing about Mountains of Madness that's also real time in this game too is we mentioned that there are some afflictions that can occur in game. And while there is that component of during the minute, you're simultaneously playing at the same time doing it, there is a kind of meta level of real time into this game where the curses or the madness that afflicts you is ongoing. It's not like the madness doesn't afflict you in between those real time activities. You're supposed to follow that the whole game, right? So if you have a particular
no, it's just during the phases.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, I always played that. I was playing it as if it wasn't.
No,
so if you want an extra layer of fun to your game,
it's funny if
play
you
real-time action game, then do that. Actually, no, but there is an example of that game. What is the meta wallet game that you have?
Oh yeah. Pretense. We'll finish on Mountains of Madness.
Finish Mountains of Madness.
The rules are that it does stop when it's not the real-time phase. But then in videos I've seen of gameplay of that's also funny too, because you're crazy for a certain time, and then suddenly you're like, what happened, guys? I'm totally fine. Why we do so bad? But yeah, so that's technically the rule. But yeah, keeping it on is, oh man,
it's fun.
That's so funny. But yeah, then the game that you mentioned is Pretense, which is a small wallet game, which is a meta game where you basically are dealing out these certain role cards to each person that comes to, say, your game night, and they're actually playing it not as an active like sit down playing, but it's something that they're playing throughout the whole night, basically trying to see who fulfills what their card says and then getting a point for calling them out for doing that. Such as when another person at your game night might help clean up a game that was played and put it away. I was like, if I had that character card, I could call you out and then I would get a point in this game of Pretense. And so it is this meta game that is basically perpetually ongoing without any turns, any rounds. None of that is literally just when you can catch someone doing what you need them to be doing.
The truest of real time.
Yeah, you would then.
It is real time used.
And so so that's what we wanted to mention with this last category of games, real time, and then also the simultaneous play, which kind of bypass those specific concrete units of time, those terms that we were explaining in the beginning. And so I hope you guys found this helpful. And actually, if you saw any of the games that we haven't reviewed that you're interested in, I hope you guys can check it out. Or if there are games that we have reviewed and we mentioned that in this video, I hope you'll also check those out on our channel here. And so hope you'll share this video with people you play board games with, friends, family, and hopefully this helps you with learning rules more clearly. And with that, stay tuned for part 2 of this IGBG Explains on turn order, where, as I mentioned, the next one we will talk about comparing set turn order, which is more traditional way of going about it in games, to more modern ideas implemented in games where the turn order can change. And so I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel and follow us on Instagram at I Got Board Game. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye. Record.